but how we perceive menopause, our beliefs about menopause, and whether we think we're going to be a dried up old broom, which I certainly did, have an impact on how well or not well we go through menopause. We know that cognitive behavioural therapy can help with both the frequency and the extent of hot flashes, for example.
Hello, you are listening to the Late Bloomer Living podcast. I'm Yvonne Marchese, your host, and I'm so happy you're here. I created this podcast to give you inspiration and let you know you're not alone in feeling stuck in midlife. I also invite you to join the Age Agitators Club for women, where we come together monthly to hatch our plans for making waves as we age. Being part of this community for women will remind you on a regular basis that you're not too old, and it's never too late to do that thing you've been thinking about. You can find more information at latebloomerliving.com/community, and I hope to see you there. Hello, my friend. I'm very excited to introduce you today. If you haven't already heard of her, I'll say, because I feel like I'm in podcasting for midlife royalty today. I'm talking to Rachel Lankester, who I have been aware of her podcast and have listened to her podcast since about the time that I started my podcast. And she's been around doing this sort of work for far longer than I have. Her podcast is called Magnificent Midlife. And she is also the author of a book called Magnificent Midlife, Transform Your Middle Years, Menopause, and Beyond. She's also the founder of MenoClarity, which is an information hub about menopause. And in her spare time, she's doing a master's in gerontology. Are you still working on that right now? Is that
Yes, and I've got an assignment due next week, so I'm panicking a bit.
I love that you're going back to school. That's fantastic, Rachel. Well, Rachel, thanks so much for being with me today. I'm so glad you're here. When I was early on in the planning for the Late Bloomer Living podcast, I was doing a lot of research and trying to figure out who I might want to have on as guests. And I was listening to some other podcasts to see, well, how might mine be a little bit different or, the same or whatever. And you had a list of podcasts that you put out into the world, which led me to another podcast called Twisting the Plot, which led me to becoming friends with the hosts of that podcast, Hannah Starobin and Cecilia Dentino, who are two of my favorite people. And I just want to give them a shout out right now. And thank you for the roundabout way of introducing me to them.
Yeah, they are fabulous, aren't they? I love their podcast and everything that they stand for. And I love that idea of that we can twist our plot at any time in our lives.
Yeah. I love the title of their podcast. And I love that they have this story-based way of looking at it. Let's twist the plot. Let's change it up and see if we can look at things a little differently, which is, I think that's what you're doing, is having people look at menopause differently. And that's why I'm so excited to talk to you today, because so much of the conversation around menopause is negative, and how do we fix it?
Well, I have quite radical views about menopause, as you know, and increasingly I am thinking that menopause doesn't happen to us, it happens for us. And if we can just think of it like that, and if we can remember that whales go through menopause and then become the leaders of their pods. I'm getting in there early with my whale story.
I was thinking about you and the whale story because I am also obsessed with this idea of women being like grandmother whales. There is a whale documentary called Secrets of the Whales. It's narrated by Sigourney Weaver, and they look at these patterns of migration with whales and how the grandmothers are the keepers of vital cultural information for the whales.
And that's what we used to be.
Yeah.
And in many indigenous cultures, and other cultures that are not the dominant Anglo-Saxon society that you and I know,
Uh-huh.
women are still that. But we've lost it in our culture because we don't value aging and we don't value older women. So therefore, menopause becomes this cliff over which we just dive head first. And that's the end of meaningful life. Well, no, it's not. It's a transition. It's where we get to evolve into the next stage of who we are and who we're going to be. And it's as valid as any other stage in life. But our Anglo-Saxon Western society tells us that it's not, tells us that youth is what matters and that it's all that matters. And that when we reach a certain age, we're supposed to, sit in the corner and be quiet. And
Can you
quite frankly, I'm
imagine?
having none of that.
And really, like it was for me, it was as I approached the age of 50, and I was feeling I didn't realize I was going through a lot of perimenopause was what was happening in the background for me, but I had brain fog. I was low energy like I'd never been before. I mean, through most of my 40s. I was lonely. I felt like it was all downhill. It was a darkish time for me, and I'm a pretty optimistic person by nature. So I felt out of, like, I didn't feel like I recognized myself, you know? Um, when I started to take better care of myself, I started a morning routine, getting up and meditating and actually moving my body every day. Once I started to feel better, I realized, oh my gosh, okay, I'm almost 50, but if I feel better now than I felt in the past 10 years, who's to say I can't continue to feel good as I get older?
Exactly. We have it probably, I'm hoping to get to 90. So from the average age of menopause, 51, that's 91. So that's 40 years of life in which I am irrelevant. Really? I mean, but that is what we are told. And if we well, if there's no if, we are fed a diet, we are fed a message from very early on that aging is something negative, that women, especially, we are supposed to hide the signs of aging, we're supposed to dye our hair, we're supposed to get the Botox, we're supposed to look as if we are eternally 25 or 30, with all the anti-aging creams, with all the hair dye, with all of the messaging that comes from such an early age. Is it any wonder that we get to midlife and menopause is, the big, oh my God, it's the end of meaningful life, that we take that on board and then we feel really negative? You talked about, the end of meaningful life and and feeling that it's, that cliff edge, falling off it. Whereas if we saw life as an evolution, if we could see aging as a process, we're aging from birth. And this is what happens. There is a time in our lives when suddenly aging becomes something bad. Aging is good for a child. A teenager wants to be older, and then we get to a certain age where suddenly it's bad. And that age seems to be getting younger and younger. And that's what frightens me, especially. But if we could see life as an upwards trajectory where, you know, yes, we may experience difficulties towards the end of life. But that's why I say menopause is something that happens for us because it's a wake-up call in midlife to get our health in order, to get our stress under control, to prioritize our well-being so that we are then set up for the next stage of our lives. And I believe that, while there may be difficulties at the very end of life, if we look after our health, if we eat well, if we have lots of social interaction, if we do the kind of things that we traditionally did in tribal society, we can then live a longer life. It's when we live very socially isolated lives. Loneliness is a big killer in later life.
Mhm.
Being sedentary is not good for us. Eating lots of processed food is not good for us. Eating lots of sugar, having lots of alcohol, lots of caffeine, it's not something that traditionally we did necessarily in a tribal society. So the further we get away from that, I believe the more difficulties we encounter. And I think this is something that I encourage people to stay curious about. Why are these things happening to me? If I, for example, now there's a lot of narrative around taking hormones to protect us from heart disease and osteoporosis and diabetes and Alzheimer's and even early death. Well, I would prefer us to say, if my risk of those things has increased a lot from previous generations, why is that? I don't just want a pill to make me supposedly better. I want to explore, why has that changed, and to make changes that reflect my awareness of what has changed. And there's a lot that has changed in our modern lives that I think contributes to difficulties with menopause, makes certain things about aging difficult, more difficult, and internalized gendered ageism is a good place to start, because that has a big impact on how we age, how we go through menopause, and our overall experience of getting older.
Yeah. Yeah. I encourage anybody to check out the work of Becca Levy around that.
Yes,
What was the title of her book, which my brain just fizzled out on me. Anyway, I'll put it in the show notes
yes.
for anyone who's
It's a brilliant
interested.
book.
Yeah. Um, I would love to talk about your journey from where you started on, your thoughts about menopause and what that meant to where you are now, because I'm looking at something that I had cut and pasted from, I think, a bio of yours, perhaps on your website. It said that, you were catapulted into you had an early diagnosis of menopause at 41, and you allowed that to completely change. You said, I allowed the diagnosis to completely change my perception of who I was as a woman, and I saw myself as a dried up old prune. I can relate to that. I just want to say, so I'd love to know, at what point did you start to feel differently about that?
It took a while. It
Mm-hmm.
really took a while. The first thing was that I went to see a nutritionist called Dr. Marilyn Glenville, and she put me on a special diet and gave me a tincture which I think had some Agnus castus in, but I'm not 100% sure.
Had what in
But
it?
the
Sorry.
Agnus castus, which is a herb used for fertility,
Mm.
it's used because all this came about because I went for a fertility test because I was trying for another child, and my partner had he had 3 children of his own and he'd had a vasectomy. So we were establishing whether or not it was worthwhile doing a reverse vasectomy. And I thought it was only fair for me to go and have a hormone test before he went under the knife for the reverse vasectomy.
Fair. Mm-hmm.
That was why I went for a hormone test. And of course, now I know that having a test of your hormones anytime in the perimenopause years is a complete waste of time. And women are still testing for hormones. And yet we can present one day one way and one day the next day, because what happens in perimenopause is our hormones are going all over the place. So what happened to me was I presented on a particular day and I went to doctors and they came back and said, you've gone through menopause. Now, that was even wrong, because I now know that you've gone through menopause if you are 2 years without a bleed if you're under 50, and 1 year without a bleed if you're over 50. Nobody asked me about the bleeding. They just said, you've gone through menopause, you've no chance of having a child. And that was the
Wow.
bomb just dropped.
Wow.
And the bottom fell out of my world, because that was what I had been dreaming of for years and years, ever since I'd had the first one. And so that was pretty devastating. But I'm always curious. I always like to say, well, why has this happened? What's going on? And this led me, I went to a conference by the Daisy Network, which is brilliant. And they specialize in women who've gone through early menopause. And that conference was a real eye opener, because even though I was earlier than supposedly normal, there were a lot of women there who were much earlier and who hadn't had a chance to have any children at all. So I felt like a bit of a fraud there. But I went to see this nutritionist and she put me on this special diet. And within 5 weeks of going on the special diet, I had a bleed. So And then I went
Wow.
back for a hormone test. I was told everything was pre-menopause. I could go ahead and ask my beloved to have the reverse vasectomy, which he did. It didn't work, didn't get the child, but I like to think, didn't get the baby, but I like to think of the book as my baby. But the diet, um, I have maintained. And that, I believe, is what has enabled me to, you know, move through the transition well. I did eventually go on hormone therapy, but it was another 3 years before I did. And then I only did because they'd asked me to go for a bone density scan just to check my bones. And I was found to have borderline osteopenia in one hip. So I thought, okay, Rachel, suck it up, go on the hormone therapy. So I did, and then I came off it at 51. But my story is that I was able to transition off at 51 because I had put in place all of the things that I had learned from the nutritionist when I was put on the special diet at 41. And those were, I don't have any caffeine. So I haven't had any caffeine since I was 41. I'm 57 now, so that's a long time. I
Wow, that
love
is.
it. I love being caffeine free. It's
Mhm.
not, not a problem for me. I love it. I was to have no sugar. I'm not so good with no sugar. That is one thing I'm not so good with. But we all kind of are learning that sugar isn't that good for us. So no caffeine, no sugar, no alcohol. Products, the food I was eating to be as organic as possible, to avoid spikes in my blood sugar. So this was the main thing, to get my blood sugar levels consistent. Because what happens in perimenopause is that the adrenal glands eventually take over the production of estrogen. It doesn't go away completely. We maintain levels of estrogen, but the adrenals are producing more estrogen. If we are highly stressed, either because we are actually stressed or our body believes we are under stress because our blood sugar levels are fluctuating wildly, then the adrenals will prioritize production of stress hormones over the estrogen that we need to
Mm.
maintain more of a consistency. And that is where the symptoms come from.
Mm.
So when we have more of an understanding of this, we can put in place things. We can eat better. I was to eat little and often, and that's what I did. And now I'm very aware of, not allowing my blood sugar levels to spike. It's just something that I try and do as much as possible. And to eat, I think, is it high glycemic load things? I'm not really very good at all that stuff, but things that are not going to either let my blood sugar levels drop because I haven't had something, or spike because I've eaten the wrong thing. Also, it was, as well as food to be organic, it was the products I used. So it was skincare, it was cleaning products, because all of these things, many of them have hormone disruptors in them that we are beginning to learn have, an impact on our hormones, potentially on our hormonal balance. And what it's about is the toxic load. It's the amount of things that are piling up on us.
And
You
you
know,
think it's just a little bit, but when you're using a bajillion different products,
exactly. And we
right?
do. Women use so many different products every day. Um, so I think when we talk about, there are some people that say, menopause, it's really, really difficult. And I know it can be for some women. And commentators will say it's much worse now, or our mothers suffered in silence. I don't actually believe that they suffered in silence en masse. Some may, but I believe that our lives have changed. They're much more stressful now. We work in completely different ways now. We have all the pressures of social media and being online all the time. We have smartphones. We have war in Europe. We have so many
Let's
stresses
face it,
and
this is a
strains.
stressful moment in the
It's
world.
a
Yes.
very stressful moment in the world. And we know that stress contributes to difficult menopause experiences. We know that trauma, unprocessed trauma, can impact how you go through menopause. And certainly we know, because we've already talked about it, that how we perceive menopause, our beliefs about menopause, and whether we think we're going to be a dried up old broom, which I certainly did, have an impact on how well or not well we go through menopause. we know that cognitive behavioral therapy can help with both the frequency and the extent of hot flashes, for example. It's been proven that that can help because so much of there's many things that contribute to a hot flash. And when I came off the hormone therapy, the first time I had a hot flash, I'd had some alcohol and then I had some chocolate. So I was my own guinea pig. I knew that it was the sugar that was causing the hot flash. But we also know that stress causes a hot flash.
I've
We know that,
experienced that. I'm just going to say, but I love that
yeah.
you've gone in this direction with the conversation. I definitely, when I was having hot flashes regularly, I started to notice a direct correlation
Yeah.
to having a stressful thought about
Mhm.
something or getting a little upset about something, and a hot flash would kick in. Um, and it would
It still
happen.
happens to me now.
Yeah.
If I'm stressed, I can get hot.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I would sit and meditate in the mornings, and the when I am on hormone replacement therapy now, so it has all but gotten rid of hot flashes and the night sweats and the waking up in the middle of the night. That was definitely a problem for me. It was very disruptive for my sleep. I went a few years before I decided to do hormone replacement therapy, but there were a number of issues happening for
Yeah.
me that finally convinced me to try it out. And I am now hot flash free and I'm sleeping better through the night. So I consider those two things a win. But while I was still having the hot flashes, and I was really trying to come up with natural ways to manage stress, and through the diet, I was trying to cut back on my sugar, at least cut back on my caffeine. And I hardly drink at all anymore because my body just doesn't like it. It just
Mm.
doesn't. And that I didn't tie that into menopause at all. It just is.
It's totally menopause.
That
It
could be.
totally is.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So there you go. There you go. I have found that like even one drink, I'll wake up and feel in the morning like I have a hangover, and I'm like, well,
I've
this
given
just
it up
isn't
completely.
worthwhile.
I've given it up completely.
Yeah.
I
But I
decided it
I
just
would
wasn't worth it.
yeah, right. I would sit and meditate, and then if hot flash would kind of rise, you get that feeling from deep inside, and it would come up. And my first reaction to that, I think, is like most women's, I assume, in that you start to get more stressed out because a hot flash is coming and you
Yep.
recognize it. And it's like, oh my gosh, here comes a hot flash. And instead of letting myself get upset by it while I was meditating, I would sit and go, okay, well, let's just look at this. Let's observe the hot
Hmm.
flash.
Hmm.
What's happening? And isn't that interesting? Isn't that
Hmm.
interesting how that feels? And I would just get curious about it, and it would calm me. And I feel like the hot flashes came and went much more quickly. It's completely subjective, but that was my observation for myself, is that by not getting upset about the hot flash, it would come and go much more quickly and be less intense, you know?
But if we feel shame associated with menopause, which so many women do, because it's a definitive sign that we are getting older,
Yeah.
and that
And
so
old
many
may as well
things
be,
are
you may as well
changing.
put an E on the end of the word old and turn it into a four-letter word,
Yes,
because that's how everybody feels about that word,
exactly.
right?
But if there's shame associated with menopause, then there's shame associated with a hot flash. If you take away the shame, then the hot flash is diminished. I now talk about hot flashes as a power surge. And
Mm.
in I think it was Stella, you were talking about my interview with Stella Duffy, and she's done a PhD research. She done her PhD research on the embodied experience of postmenopause, and she talks about one um, indigenous community. I've forgotten where they are, but they talk about hot flashes as the rising of the animal spirit.
Mm.
And doesn't that put a completely different face on it?
Again, it's the
I
stories
mean,
we tell ourselves, right? That is
exactly.
an empowering story. That
Yes,
is like, I am claiming this. There is
yes.
some, and who cares what's true, frankly.
Yeah, as long as it works. That's what I say to women. I say, pick a narrative that works for you. If you hear a narrative and it doesn't do you any good, why go with that narrative? Why go with that disempowering narrative? Go with something that empowers you and works for you, and work with that one. Choose that one. Take that one. Own it.
Can you believe it is really the question.
Yeah. You've got to work with something that works for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So you went to that conference. Let's go back to that journey of yours from feeling like the dried up old prune. You went to the conference. Do, would you say it took you 3 years? Do you have like any kind of a timeline in your head for how long it took to make the shift in your brain?
Yeah, because it was about 3 or 4 years, and then I decided I'd really had enough of the narratives I was hearing. And I became aware of Ashton Applewhite
Mm,
and her
yes.
work and her book, This Chair Rocks, and her TED Talk, Let's End Aging. And she then went on to speak at the UN about Let's End Aging. And she completely transformed the way I thought about aging. And I think it was reading her book right at the beginning of my journey that just sort of spearheaded me into thinking, we need to think about menopause differently. The way that I responded to that early menopause diagnosis wasn't right. So I got my periods back for a time, but then I went back to being supposedly postmenopausal, but I think the diagnosis was wrong. I think I was actually in perimenopause, but it was all very confusing. But what I realized was I had more agency. I had more agency on what I put into my body, how I lived in the world, and what I thought about both menopause and aging. And because I was 10 years ahead of, my friends, if average age is 51, although now I also know that we're in perimenopause in our 40s and usually we don't know we are. I wanted to communicate that to women. I wanted to increase awareness so that people did not think they were going to be a dried up old prune, did not think it was the end of meaningful life, did appreciate that this happened for us rather than to us, did appreciate that there were changes that we could make that would make our experience much better, did appreciate that it was a tunnel, not a cave, and that life on the other side can be pretty damn good. And that actually this represents a time to reinvent ourselves. It's not the end, it's a new beginning. So all of these things I wanted to tell other women. So that led to the podcast, that led to the book, and the book, I was so fed up of reading books about menopause that just repeated all the negativity, repeated all the, oh, it's going to be really, really difficult. Well, it may be difficult, but that doesn't have to be the overwhelming narrative. So I wanted to give women a toolbox for midlife. And also, I wanted menopause to just be a part of midlife because it's kind of, certainly here in the UK, it's become everything. We are defined by our hormones. We're not defined by our hormones. So I talk about midlife as a cake, and I talk about wanting menopause to be one or two slices of your midlife cake. And that's it. Unless you have subscribe to my view of menopause that it's this amazing transformational experience, and then you can have the whole damn cake. But otherwise, I want it to just be one or two slices, and we deal with that. Yes, it can be messy, but give you a toolkit where you can manage it, and that there is light at the end of that tunnel, and you can get the support you need. You know where to go to get the support you need. So yeah, that's really why I do what I do, because I just think education is so important.
Were you a podcast listener before you started your podcast? What year was it?
I used to listen to Tim Ferriss.
Ah, yeah.
I
Uh-huh.
used to listen to him religiously. I loved him, and I never listen to him anymore. But I used to listen to him, and I liked his way of doing long form interviews,
Hmm.
and that it sort of rambled, but in a structured way. So I like that. And so I listened to him. I didn't listen to a lot of podcasts, but I did listen to him. Yeah.
And what made you think I could do a podcast?
I wanted to tell women's stories. So what I do is I ask the questions and my guests really do the podcast. But I wanted to highlight their stories. I wanted to celebrate older women. I wanted to empower older women. I wanted to give them the information that they needed, but through somebody else. So I feel I'm just really the vehicle for my guests. It has enabled me to find my voice, and every season now I do a solo podcast, but mainly it's about my guests. So I don't know. I don't know. I just I thought nobody's saying the things I want to be heard. Nobody's doing this. And I mean, there's lots of midlife podcasts now, but there weren't when I started.
There were
There
not. Yeah.
really weren't. And
Thank you for doing the pioneer work on it.
well, I get a bit annoyed because all these other ones, they've got, their big celebrity podcasts and they've got loads of followers, and there's little old me plugging away in the
I
background, and they've all gone off to stratosphere, and I'm like, I'm still doing my thing.
I totally feel you on that. But on the other hand, it's funny too, because so I'm coming up on a 4-year anniversary with the podcast. And I did feel like there were a lot of midlife podcasts even 4 years ago,
Mm.
and certainly there are now, and celebrities have jumped on the bandwagon. What I do find very hopeful about that is I feel like there is a movement happening around looking at aging, looking at the opportunity that's there for us as opposed to the woe is me, oh my gosh, it's all over. And I feel like the more voices that we have coming
Mm.
together to talk about this, hopefully people who aren't naturally interested in this topic will come across one of us and go, oh, I didn't realize I was doing this to myself,
Mm.
because I did not
No,
know that
no.
my own internalized ageism was holding me back until after I started to feel better.
Mm.
And I looked back at what was going on and went, oh, it was all me telling myself I was done.
Yeah.
And it's not my fault. It's the
Yeah.
conversation in the world. I don't know
Hmm.
if you notice this talking to people,
Absolutely.
just general conversation. It is
Hmm.
just so negative around aging.
Hmm.
And it
And
just
for
makes me
women,
hopeful
especially for
for
women,
women. Yes.
men are
Yes.
allowed to age. They can become silver foxes.
Yeah.
We're just supposed to cover it all up and hide and pretend that we're not aging. And
Yeah.
that's rubbish.
Yeah. Truth. Well, I appreciate all the work you're doing. Um, so you have resources for people, which I want to mention again. I mentioned it at the beginning. MenoClarity is a resource hub for women who want more information about menopause, correct?
Yes, a group of us got together from all over the world. We span New Zealand, Canada, UK, Scandinavia, Middle East. And these are women actually that I met, most of them through the podcast, and then met them through people, friends of friends sort of thing. And we're all very concerned about the negativity, and we're concerned about the false information that's being put out. We're concerned about the clickbait headlines where they throw something out just to get people to click on it and to scare people. And the fact that women are now scared of menopause. They're scared that if they don't take hormone therapy, they're going to get all sorts of nasty diseases. And there's a big movement out there to get everybody onto hormone therapy and for life. And yet, there are people like, I'm trying to think of her name. I'm always quoting her, Susan P. Matten, who wrote The Slow Moon Climbs, where she talks about the fact that, and the new book, Eve, actually, that menopause is part of our evolutionary success as a species. it's because we have the grandmothers post-menopause, that we've been so successful. So it's not something negative. It's not something that brings disease. It's something that happens to us. And yes, we may be at greater risk of these things post-menopause, but that's because we're getting older. It's not just because of menopause. So a group of us got together to try. We felt that the pendulum had swung too far, that it had become too much about fear. And we know that fear does not lead into health. We know that if we fear something, we're likely to have a worse experience of it. So we wanted to redress the balance. We wanted to provide information that women could trust, that is reliable, that isn't just some clickbaity headline. We are not affiliated to anybody. We don't make any money. We don't have another agenda. That's the other thing I always say to women is who is telling you what and what's their agenda? Why are they telling you it? Usually there's some money somewhere behind it. So we're not affiliated with anybody. We try and be as objective as possible. We try and give you all the information, not just some of the information. So that's what MenoClarity is all about. And that we've really been we're quite popular. People are very pleased that we're a voice out there, a voice of reason. That's what we are. We're just trying to be a calm, collected, cool voice of reason and say, is this true? Is this really helpful? What else might be helpful? And what do you need to know? And what can you
Where do
trust?
people go to check out MenoClarity?
So it's menoclarity.com.
Okay, terrific. And
Yeah.
for you and getting in touch with you, what's the
For
best
me,
spot?
magnificentmidlife.com. Everything's on there. The book, the podcast. I do midlife mentoring as well. So yeah, all of that's on there.
You're a trailblazer, and I appreciate all the work you're doing. And I thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me today and talk about it.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been lovely. I'm so glad that we got to connect.
Me too. I feel like I've known you for a long time, and it's so funny that we have only recently connected. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it. Oh my goodness, I'm so glad I got the chance to talk to Rachel finally. And I just want to call something out as a challenge for you, for me, any woman, and maybe some doctors out there in the world. What if we change the narrative around menopause to not have it be such a negative thing? What if we were to look at it as something that's happening for us, not something that's happening to us? How much more empowering is that idea? Just something to think about. Mull it over. I don't know. So anyway, thank you so much for being with me today and listening all the way here to the end. If you want more information about Rachel, I will have a link for you in the show notes. You can just go to latebloomerliving.com and look for episode 191. There you go. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a fantastic week. Stay safe and well, and talk soon.